Hello and welcome back for our fourth match with Bug in Vintage. We are on the draw with another hand that really doesn't do anything with Black Lotus, and in fact has the stellar combination of Null Rod Black Lotus. So, Cedric, you were probably right about this Vintage deck not wanting Black Lotus in it. It doesn't do anything. Which is a very odd thing to say. Because, you would think any deck of magical cards probably wants Black Lotus. This one actually just doesn't. It's not very good. So maybe we will get to play against Mishra's Workshop, seeing as we metagamed pretty heavily against Mishra's Workshop. Alas, we are probably playing against another fidgety blue deck. So I think we just play out our Lotus and pass. And if that means that we get to sucker our opponent into doing something to the Lotus, then so much the better, because there are many other cards that I would rather have in play right now than Black Lotus. Which is obviously a weird thing to say, but unfortunately, Mr. Menendian could not rejoin the queue, but dropped some good insights on sort of how this deck is supposed to be played, which is to say that we want to focus on trading resources even more aggressively than we were doing. So our opponent vampiricked for what I assume is Standstill. We could have flashed in Snapcaster Mage, but I'm fine just playing out lands. I was about to wasteland his colored source, but then I realized that if you're playing Standstill, you're probably also playing Mishra's Factories, so we probably want to wait for those. Also, we just have a bunch of lands. I'm fine, getting to 7 cards in a Lotus in play, and then just, tagging our opponent's mana. So I think what we want to discard is an Abrupt Decay. But let's think really hard about this. Odds that someone has Standstill in a deck with a ton of artifact mana. Probably pretty low, since you want to hit land drops with Standstill, artifacts sort of disrupt that. I can imagine playing some, because accelerating in a control deck is sweet, but not a ton. I don't think Null Rod is going to be especially good. That said, I think it's a unique and disruptive effect, so I don't want to discard it. I think we can probably discard one of these Abrupt Decays, and just flash it back. Rats. Now our opponent is hitting land drops. I think we're fine discarding Spell Pierce. So our opponent goes up to 11 cards, counters our Snapcaster Mage, and discards a few. Wow. I accept. Ashiok? This is a sweet deck our opponent has going on here. Also fine with that. I think we just want to stop our opponent from resolving something truly devastating for us. Like that. Hold your missteps for their recalls is my experience with things. Okay, I don't think that they're going to be able to pay for this. And now we're down to like a low resource situation where we're vulnerable to a Jace, but yeah, he had to draw a land, which he did. But also this Null Rod was like, we overvalued the Null Rod. It was basically how like we are going to end up having lost this game. Because we're going to end up losing to all of the cards that our opponent gets ahead on because of Jace. And then it's possible that we also should have been like trying to nug them out with Deathrite Shaman on all of their stuff, instead of fighting an even longer, more attrition-y game that they're set up to win. Because now our opponent can... Okay, well that didn't really matter, but had we discarded Null Rod instead of something else, then we would have had a blue card in our hand, like Null Rod instead of Spell Pierce. Okay. We are very much out of this game with Creeping Tar Pit, Jace, and Stand Still against us. So, pretty basic like fish versus land still sort of matchup. Abrupt Decay obviously very bad. All of the like blue BS is sort of whatever. Nemesis probably pretty good since they're playing Jace. Jace can't bounce Nemesis, etc. And just like getting a bunch of disruption in here. I'm trying to think of like they didn't play Snapcaster Mage, right? Yeah, we played Snapcaster Mage. Oh, they discarded Snapcaster Mage. Okay. So we could reasonably get a Spell Bomb or 2 in here. So I think we'll do that. And I'm happy with this. This feels sort of like Bug Delver versus Shardless Bug, in that like they've got draw 3s and Planeswalkers to go along, and we have to stop them before they can get the ball rolling on their stuff. My heuristics also might just be off here. Maybe we were supposed to Thoughtseize on turn 1. But like, I always play Deathrite when possible. The reason why we're not casting Trigon Predator right now is because I don't want to let them develop their game too much. So they can scroll for recall. They've got some Planeswalkers. They have Mystical and Vamp, so like, whatever happens, they're going to end up casting recall. The only real question is how much we get to So like they can Mystical for recall, Vamp for force, and then for sure push through. Well, no, they can't. Okay. I think we take their Ashiok and try and play a shorter game that involves them suffering a lot of card disadvantage from their top deck tutors and us misstepping their recall. So this is going well. Like, they're going to Mystical, or not, and so like we get to take their scroll, and then they Mystical for recall and we misstep it, is I think what's going to happen. Yeah, I was expecting them to fight a longer game than they did. Like, they just tried to move in super fast. So I'm going to gamble that they're going to get recall and we're going to misstep it. I am wrong. Yeah, that was painful. Also fine with them casting Demonic Tutor if it means getting recall out of their deck. And there it is. And there's our Bob, right on time. So we have empty hands. They just have to brick on Abrupt Decay here, I guess. That's like the card that handles this situation. I'm fine with them wastelanding us when we have Bob. That is just like super okay. But yeah, this is like the game state that every bug deck tries to craft. Also, Jesus, wow. I kinda don't care. I'm gonna force it anyway. I also can imagine a world in which they like have Toxic Deluge and we don't want to lose both our Bobs. So holding here. Obviously not vamping for force because that would be suicidal. Probably not casting vamp at this point, actually. So I think I just want to put lethal in play. Okay, so we put back 2 lands and win the game. Cool. So that's basically a clinic on how you beat a deck that has 3 tutors and 2 planeswalkers and 3 lands. It's just like they tutor for Lotus and you have force, or like you let them grind themselves down and counter the one spell that they are trying to set up. Both of which are like viable options. Now that we know that they aren't really playing any artifacts, I think it's time for these predators to come out. I think it's possible that we just want like more dudes, period. Although like I'm fine having like a dude and a decay to tutor force so that like if their Ashiok gets out of control, then we've got that on tap. But yeah, snap keeping this one. Death right into Bob with force backup. Not really something you can mulligan. Also kind of comical that this is a realistic hand in Legacy, except our opponent can roll up with like landmark standstill or, you know, yeah, Lotus. Perfect. Lotus strip mine. Absolutely perfect. Well, I got Deathrite Shaman, so feel free to strip mine me. Man, this Null Rod really would have done a lot of work. So we force, they force back. As it turns out, Lotus J's still really good. Kind of unfortunate that this decay could have been a Trigon Predator, and that would have also been the difference in this game. Since we would have had another blue card for Force of Will, and we would have just taken out his Jason, that would have been it. It really is just like a game of such small edges, and like these games feel winnable, whereas the other games do not. Yeah, we're just out of this game. Just dead. But yeah, this deck feels very real. The Blue-Eyed Angels deck, to sort of revisit the ways in which I was right and wrong from last week. The Angels deck felt like too high curve, too few mana sources. Like, I took the list from the NYSC2 Open, which is like a $100 anti-tournament, so I assume people are rolling up with like best versions of decks, and deck that finished highest among its archetype is probably going to be like the best version of that deck. But it's entirely reasonable that I should have done like more research, read into the mana drain, which, you know, is basically the source but for vintage players, and found out that like a lot of people thought that 23 was too few lands, or too few mana sources. But I'm still pretty interested in standing firm on thinking that drain is like not great. There are like, if you're playing drain, you're probably playing a deck that's incredibly vulnerable to shops. And if you're playing drain, you're also playing a bunch of reactive cards that don't do anything against dredge. So at that point, you're like trying to out control the blue players, except you can also lose to like a bunch of random other stuff. And in the spots where like you still get your drain to fire, you don't have a guarantee that it's better than counterspell. And I can think of like 5 blue counters off the top of my head that are better than actual factual counterspell, like blue counter target spell in vintage. Like, I'm playing like 5 of them, right? Like, Pierce is better, Flusterstorm is better, Steel Sabotage is better. Like, I would play a Null over it, and I would probably even like look into Daze. But Drain just seems like such a heavy commitment, and then like you're talking about building a mana base where you can reliably cast a blue spell. So we're looking at like, realistically, for like counterbalance decks, you generally want like 17 blue sources at the bare minimum, and you want like 17 blue sources at the bare minimum to be able to cast your blue thing on turn 2. And like, if you're not casting it on turn 2, then like, what is it doing in your deck? You're playing Vintage, like you could die on turn 2. Like, just literally be dead. Like, if you're playing a counterspell, presumably you want it against combo decks sometimes. So like, if it's not rolling out on the timeline that like combo decks are trying to interact, then what's the point? Oh, also like, yeah, Misstep. Misstep is way better than Mana Drain in my opinion. Like, just counters the most important spell in like most of your matchups. Like, it either protects you from duress and counters Dark Ritual against combo, or it like fights the recall war efficiently, as opposed to being like, recall, drain it, pierce it, like, done. The game has ended. Player 2 is victorious. But like, even this deck, which like has stuff to do with colorless mana, right? Like, it can like Snapcaster Mage, flashback, you know, various stuff. You could probably rebuild it to like have some Jaces. It just like, at the point where you're playing Drain and putting a bunch of stuff that pays you for playing Drain in your deck, I think your deck is just unacceptably slow. And it may just be that like, I'm wrong, but my experience of Vintage is that like, decks are blisteringly fast, and you can't actually afford to put enough mana in your deck to reliably cast Drain, while also like casting all of your other spells, and like playing enough spells that don't get paid off by Drain to make sure that you don't die so that you can cast Drain. But for all of that, me still thinking that I'm right about Drain, yeah, I could have done more research. However, still not tremendously sold on Blue-Eyed Angels. I am tremendously sold on this deck, even though I lost a bunch of games with it, because I think that it's more customizable. Like, we're playing a bunch of like pretty narrow cards that are targeted at a specific metagame. Like, we didn't play against shops, and like our sideboard is pretty aggressively targeted at shops. Like, I would love to play against a Mishra's Workshop with like this stuff in our main deck and this stuff in our sideboard. But, and like especially with Deathrite Shaman, jeez. So, you know, also pretty heavily metagamed, and the nice thing is that like you can just cut a bunch of the metagaming cards and you still have a powerful shell. So, like, that's why I like what Bug has going on, is because like Snapcaster Mage and Dark Confidant are high power level cards that can like answer anything and snowball an advantage on an open board, and like let you play with the best cards, whereas Stoneforge Mystic is like still a pretty board oriented creature. Like, if you cast your 2-drop and the combo deck passes the turn back to you, my expectation is that your 2-drop should win the game for you. And again, my philosophy of Vintage is like very underformed given how little I've played it, and like I would be happy to argue more vehemently on like your 4-drop should win the game for you in Legacy, which I do believe. Like, Natural Order and Jace, like, if those cards aren't winning the game for you, then you've built your deck wrong. But like, I think that the same has to be true in Vintage of your 2-drop. So like, Snapcaster Mage can win the game for you. Like, you just set up recall and like recall Snapcaster recall, you win the game. Like, you cast Dark Confidant, it lives, you win. You cast Null Rod, sometimes it wins. You cast the Ixalan Jailer, win. Like, Trigon Predator on 2 off of like Deathrite Shaman or a Mox, win. But like, you cast Stoneforge Mystic, it does nothing, you ship it back, you've like drawn a card, except the card you drew is a 5-drop. And then like, the next turn it does nothing again, and you put a 4/4 lifelink into play. That's not like, that's not the same level of thing as anything else. And it reminds me more of like Smokestack, except you don't get to play Mishra's Workshop. You get to play basic Plains, which like isn't the same thing at all. So those are my thoughts. and for all of like the, you know, justifiable ridicule that I got in the forums last week, I think that Vintage is due for a pretty big overhaul. Just like the amount of data that is going to be generated on the format is going to be enormous, and change is inevitable when that much data gets generated on something that is that data light. And that is sort of like what I was trying to get at pretty inelegantly last time, is that there are so many people playing Vintage and they have so many ideas that some of them are just going to be better than like stuff that was created by very smart people, because very smart people miss stuff constantly. Like, I know my fair share of smart people, and they just like, they miss stuff. And so I look forward to seeing what the Hive Mind brings. I like Vintage just as much as you, dear reader, and I welcome everything that's about to happen over the next however long on Magic Online. So, with that, I'll sign off. It's been fun, and I'll see you next week.